She's got a great presentation called Remote Studio. Are you calling it that? Great. Thanks very much. Welcome, Lori.
Hi, everyone. I've been told I have to stand really close to this mic, so we'll see how it works. So different than, I guess, the previous presentations and speakers that you have heard, I'm going to be talking from a more academic perspective and talk to you a little bit about a program that I've started that relates to a not-for-profit that I founded. And in listening to the last session, one of the things that became clear to me is that we're all basically here with the same common interest. We've all had very common recognition of what's going on either in our area or more globally what's going on in the planet, and recognizing that things are changing rapidly, especially in the West, that we're seeing a big change in the environment. We're seeing depletion of resources. We all kind of know this, so I can kind of dispense with my reason for what the program the reason the program exists. But one of the things that I was thinking about listening to the last groups was that I think that the big issue here is not the kind of incremental components of green design or sustainability. I think that as people are talking about issues of paradigm shifts, that to me it's about a paradigm shift, and the paradigm shift actually has to come from people taking responsibility for their actions. And that is something, I guess, that can be market driven. I think we're starting to see that just in journals and in news coverage, etc. But it also is a primarily educational issue. So, and when I say that educational, I don't mean only K through 12 or only university. But if we want to see change, it's not just from saying, like people were saying before, oh, well, that nobody wants to take this on, or the general public isn't interested. I think that a lot of people don't understand yet. They still don't know, so they're not taking responsibility. I mean, we've got a couple of generations that broadly were just, and I'm part of it, just not taught to take responsibility. Anyhow, so I was trained as an architect, and when I started kind of recognizing that there were what I see as problems going on in the environment and the world and people's health, etc., I started to think to myself, well, what can I do about this? And being trained as an architect, I looked at my own educational abilities and my educational experience, and I asked myself, more deeply, why do we build? And how do we build? And where do we build? And what do we build with? I mean, those seem like really basic questions, but to me, that's really the foundation that I come to things from. And that I happen to believe in asking those questions or addressing those issues, that successful architecture is born out of, and this was also mentioned in the last session, integrated and holistic processes. In other words, we can't just look at where we build and not think about how we build or think about what we build from or even why we build. We have to take it all together. And as a community, I mean, there's a reason that we are talking about these issues as a community, because that in itself has to be an integrated kind of attack in this new way of looking at things. And it doesn't mean that anybody or everybody is going to do it perfect. But if everybody gets out there and begins to say, what can I take responsibility from, that's where change is going to occur. So for the most part, that's a big focus of the program that I started, the Remote Studio. And so the first slide's up there. So the issue of Artemis Institute really is to explore the relationship of nature to creativity. my research focused on basically not just the practical issues, but what people might call the more esoteric, but the philosophical issues of understanding the world, nature, place, and how that relates to creative inspiration, and how then those processes or those ideologies are taken forward into making successful architecture. So, you guys can read, because I'm not going to read all the slides. I think you can read it as we're going. But basically, so the Artemis Institute recognizes that how we understand the world relates to how we react to it. And from that idea, I developed a program called the Remote Studio. And I should back up and say that I was tenured at MSU before I resigned to teach this program full time. So I had 12, 15 years worth of teaching and architecture programs before I launched this. And in addition to that, I practice and I write, but I'm just going to be talking about the Remote Studio. So the Remote Studio is a university program for students of architecture and art, which provides them the opportunity to gain a better understanding of how their creative processes and ability are tied to their responsibility to the world. The way that I look at it is, if you want architecture to be different, if you want the built environment to change, then you must change not only where, but how and what students are being taught. So the goals of the program are twofold. One is to provide students with firsthand experiences that focus and empower their commitment to the world in which they live. And the second is to provide local communities near large wilderness areas, since we're here in Montana, with thoughtful built interfaces that then in turn can inspire their commitment to the world. So while many people have been talking about working in more urban environments, the Remote Studio is predominantly a rural committed program, and that has to do with the fact that I think that people are feeling very separated. You know, that's the wilderness, this is where I live, this is where I stop taking responsibility for things, and that architecture belongs in the city and it doesn't really matter what happens after that. So part of the idea of the community relationship, which you'll see an example of later, is to help people feel a more seamless relationship between where I live and where I play, where I experience the natural world, and that it's really not this separate thing. So, well, I guess some of these slides aren't going to show up because it's kind of light in here. So with the Remote Studio, there's basically a three-part format that I teach. It's a semester program where they're taking at least 12 credits from me. The program exists in Paradise Valley. I have a small ranch on loan that's right on the Yellowstone River. And the program is open to students across the country. Primarily, the students right now are coming from MSU Bozeman, but I am getting students from other universities. I have interests from Harvard, MIT, Cornell, and so I think the program will become nationally successful, and then from that we'll be able to go back out, the students that go through the program, and influence other ideology, other people across the country. So as I was saying, there's a three-part format. The students are involved in philosophical readings and environmental readings and discussions. They're also involved in backcountry experiences. And the third thing is being able to test their ideology through the development of firsthand project experiences, which you guys will see also as the slides continue. But the idea is that it really takes this three-part educational condition to have them begin to understand how they belong to the world, what their responsibilities are, not just as becoming an architect, but becoming responsible people on the planet. And so the philosophical discussions actually allow them to talk about what they're thinking about. And students don't really get that opportunity. You might think that that happens in the university level, but it doesn't really. And then the backcountry experiences, basically my research and my belief shows that if you want people to take responsibility for things, they have to love it. So they have to love the things that they have experienced. So rather than me standing up and saying, you need to take responsibility for the natural world, you need to take responsibility for wildlife, you need to pay attention to wildlife corridors, the idea is to take them out into the backcountry for these experiences firsthand. And then to then allow them to test this kind of developing ideology in the making of things. So I'm not going to talk about all these slides, but it basically chronicles the program. So I'm going to flip through some of this without talking. I did say that the program was in Paradise Valley, so that's Park County, and one of the reasons is because there's such a large wilderness area for the students to experience. So it allows them to go out there and have one-on-one experiences. The groups I teach are somewhere between 9 and 12 students at a time. I teach the program twice a year. It's kind of like a regular semester, yearly program, except for I teach in the summer and in the fall because there is, like I said, this kind of testing program that you'll see, and you really can't have 2 feet of snow outside to do it in. So one of the other aspects in this idea of experience and firsthand experiences is issues of contemplation. And what I mean by that is that what I'm trying to do is not just impart knowledge, but to encourage knowledge that transforms into wisdom. And there's a great idea that Aristotle claimed, that from wisdom, the wisdom grows out of the relationship between adventure and leisure. And so if you think about the idea of firsthand experience, that really is where adventure comes from. When you do something on your own, whether it's in the backcountry or whether it's making something or whether it's thinking about an idea, that adventure comes from that. And that we can't always be making, that you actually have to have this time of contemplation to begin to understand what your experiences mean and to begin to form an ideology. That idea isn't really addressed very well either in university programs. It seems like it's very much about produce, think, and not really contemplate. So we try to spend a fair amount of time, I guess what people would call downtime, but in contemplation or thinking about what you have experienced and not necessarily just jumping into the next issue. The experiences in the backcountry are also quite rigorous. Any of you guys that spend time in the backcountry know that it's not just a hike down a trail. When you really are going into the backcountry, you have to be focused. You have to be paying attention to where you're going and how you're going to get there. And while that might seem kind of like, oh yeah, sure, we all do that in Montana, and isn't that what Montana is about? Not everybody experiences that, and surprisingly enough, most of my students, even though they can downhill ski and they can snowboard and do all those kinds of great things, mountain bike, etc., very few of them have spent time in the backcountry. But the issue of spending time in the backcountry also teaches them responsibility to one another, that they understand that they have to take care of each other if they're going to survive. And I don't mean that they're out there like in a boot camp, but seriously, I mean, they are in a more rigorous environment. And with that idea of taking responsibility and the focus on being in the backcountry, they begin to also develop mindfulness. Mindfulness, which probably all of us need to think about as a concept, really is beginning to think about what's right in front of you and focus on that and not be distracted by 5 other things. But it's being mindful of what you're doing, what's right in front of you, and the experience that you're having. And that idea of mindfulness also is what drives the creative process. It's what creates those kind of holistic, integrated aspects and ideology that's required, I think, for creating successful architecture, what a lot of people here would call sustainable or green architecture. This just shows you some of the places that we've been and some of the groups. So, as I was saying, that they have the backcountry experiences at the same time that we're doing these philosophical readings. And then there's a third component that occurs, which are what I call vessel projects. And vessel projects are provide the opportunity for the students to explore firsthand their developing ideas. And we start with they seem like simple things, what most people might call art installations. But they have to begin to explain to each other why they're doing the things that they are, how they think about how the pieces that they're making are integrated into the place. So I'm going to show you a series of those. This is one from far away, and this is it closer up. That, I think, is actually a field of daffodils or dandelions. I think what comes out of the vessel projects is a recognition that they're beginning to rely on their intuitions. We spend a lot of time in the architecture programs, and this is something that I hear from the students over and over again when we start the philosophical discussions, is how they're asked to constantly justify the things that they do. And to justify things, it means that you have to completely operate in a rational way. And I happen to think that design and art is not always rational. While we may need to understand some of the technologies, we may need to understand how green issues integrate into things, the actual process itself, in order for it to be holistic, I think draws from an inner intuition that we have, that all of us have. But this is about helping students begin to kind of refine their intuition. So these pieces that they go out and make, they don't necessarily, they have an idea about them, but different from architecture where you draw it and then somebody else builds it, or you draw it and think about it and then you might find a way to go out and build it. These students begin to think about it in their head and then go out and interact with the landscape. And then they begin to understand what that landscape is like, what the place is like that they're in. There's also a strong ethic that's built into these, that they have to, they can only use a certain amount of materials, that there's very limited destruction, that some of these that are built more in place have to be either disassembled or they have to have a period of time that they'll disassemble themselves. This is one of my favorite vessels that was ever made. Let me see if I know you guys can't see the red dot very well, but with this vessel, so one of the issues of the vessels is to make things that feel like they are fully integrated into the landscape. I mean, that's a strong principle you're going to find in integrated architecture as well. So this was a fallen log across a creek bed. And you guys, everybody walks past those all the time, so we know that they've got sticks on them all over the place. Well, this particular student cleaned all the branches off on this side and moved them down here. And what I thought was so fantastic about it was that, we walked right up on the site and the place, and we're kind of like, he's like, well, we're there. And you kind of look around and you're like, okay. And then a few seconds later, you begin to realize what has actually been achieved. I think it's really a piece of beauty. So at the same time that the students are doing philosophical readings and discussions with me, and that they're starting to work on the vessels, which occur over the first couple of months of the semester, they are also meeting a community client. And the idea here is that this is the big vessel. This is the project where they're going to work as a group, that they're going to work with a community client, and they're going to take this developing ideology and begin to apply it to a project that can be given back to the community. So they meet the client and then they begin designing. So this is just a few slides of kind of the design experience, which is somewhat similar to what happens in a regular studio, except for they're all working together rather than working one by one. And it teaches them, again, this idea of respect and responsibility for each other, respect for the client. They're given a budget. So while the program starts with this heavy philosophical underpinning, it ends with extreme practical conditions, because they must understand how to detail, they must understand how much something's going to cost, they must understand what a client's asking for, and they must do that all within their own architectural concepts. And they work in model, they work in computers, so in some ways it's very similar to even what happens in an office. They produce a set of construction drawings because they have to be able to communicate to each other what's going to be built. We have to be able to, do material counts, etc. In this stage and throughout the whole semester, I see myself more as a facilitator. I may be a professor in the sense of providing their reading lists and directing the discussions. I find the client that they're going to work with, but it's not my design project. This is their design project, and that's a distinct difference. There's quite a few practical design build programs across the country right now, but very few of them actually put the design responsibility into the hand of the students. So I try to make sure that it's going to be buildable, that we're going to be able to afford it when they're still working in the concept phase. And other than that, talking to them about how their ideas are matching what the architecture is turning into, it's really left up to them and their client. So this is the case study that I'm going to present. So this is the most dynamic component of the remote studio. It's the easiest for an audience like yourself or anybody to understand what happens at remote studio, because it is the final product. But I want you to also understand that I don't think the product could occur without the underpinnings of the philosophy, the vessels, and the backcountry experience. So this particular project was built in Paradise Valley. If any of you guys have been in this area, it's up in the Pine Creek Campground. It was just finished completely in May and open to the public. It's the 2006 project. We started in the fall. And I could go on and on about the lessons that were learned from working with a national agency, but we're not going to talk about that. It was really fascinating. But I had some great people on the ground in the Livingston District office that made sure that the project came together and that it was a great thing in the end. So for those of you that are history buffs or professionals, you'll understand that the Pine Creek Campground is a CCC campground, meaning that it's got a historical legacy to it. And the Forest Service was concerned that the pavilion, which is what they asked the students to deal with, actually fit into the philosophy of the CCC. And we got a plan book, and they got to look at kind of the typology that the Forest Service works with, which most of you, I would think, could imagine, the kind of gable-ended log cabin type things. And but they also asked us to try to make the pavilion as sustainable as possible. And so with both of those things in mind, the students kind of took off. And this is close to the site. Just above, they're looking down on it. And this is them meeting with the rangers and walking the site. the exciting thing to me for working on this project is that it's the only public covered pavilion in Park County. So for me, it was an awesome opportunity because it was going to give the county a place to meet as a group. It gives a place for the K through 12 science classes to go up and have their classes outside. It provides a place for people to get married. It provides a place for public events. And I think that, so when I say, you know, I'm focusing on rural places, it's necessary rural places. This is the site. This is what was here before. So this is the group campsite area within the campground. This also is a direct path to the main trailhead that takes you into the Absarokas. So one of the things that the Forest Service agreed to, that we had talked to them about initially, was whether or not they would provide the lumber for the project, which they said yes, they would. And so what they did was they went around and ID'd all of what they call hazard standing dead. So it's not just standing dead, but it's trees now that, because they're in the campground, they could fall on a tent or a camper because they're starting to decay. So they felled about, I think it was 6 or 8 of those. And then the students worked with one of our local mill guys who I've done quite a bit of work with. He just brought his portable mill up, and they milled the logs right on site. So what I was showing you before, the left-hand edge of the site, of the slide, is where the site is. So literally, they were just walking the lumber right to where the construction site was. So this is a series of kind of the construction phase, and you guys can imagine what it's like building in Montana in the fall, even though it was mid-October when they started laying out. Oops, wrong button. So you get these kinds of exciting moments where you're still standing in the snow even though you're trying to figure out where your building's going to go. It's great first-hand experience for the students. So they build everything. This is basically the slab getting ready to go in. They're waiting for the concrete truck to show up. And these are some of the first columns to go up. So the primary construction materials of the project are the wood that I was telling you about that got milled on the site. There's some glue lamps because the structure is quite large, and then there's steel posts. And as was mentioned earlier by one of the other speakers, steel is used because of its post-consumer recycled content and the fact that it can be recycled infinitely. In addition to the wood and steel, there's concrete, there's reclaimed concrete pavers, and there's a rammed earth wall that runs through part of the design, and the earth was collected within 2 miles of the site along the Yellowstone. So the students are taking their ideology that they've learned as far as design, but they're also taking their ideology of responsibility and applying principles of sustainability and beginning to look at green materials and green design strategies. Here they are installing the concrete pavers. That's the rammed earth wall with some collected rock from the Forest Service in the wall. Some of the finishing details. I'm doing this a little bit backwards because I'm going to talk to you about the design after. So this is the finished pavilion. It's designed to seat about 50 people. And what the students were dealing with conceptually as far as the architectural form was really looking at the environment around them, looking at what the forest was like, and thinking about one of the ideas that the Forest Service district officers talked about, which was how they looked at the campground as being a gateway to the untrammeled, because it does border right on the edge of the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness. And so with that idea, they wanted the pavilion to feel like something that you would flow through, that it was something more like a gate rather than something that was about containing. And so that's why you're not seeing a conventional gabled roof. They also were looking at the fact that the trees themselves don't stand straight up and down, but there's this beautiful poetry. You guys all know about it in the forest, how the trees move back and forth and sway. And so the building itself also has that kind of swaying quality and character. This is ADA accessible, the whole thing, which was quite a challenge for the students. And you would think that it wouldn't be, because it's just a single ground floor level issue, but you have to make the deck completely coplanar with the ground as well as the concrete pad. So getting that to work out was a bit of a challenge for them. These are just some of the details. This end in particular, you can begin to see kind of this idea of things moving, the kind of animated quality that you see in the forest. The other thing that they were thinking about was the collection of rainwater. And so right here with this kind of butterfly condition, and it happens again here, there's this kind of low-tech French drain that waters these new aspens that we planted in front of it. Because right here, you can see these are the park stops. So it was an attempt to kind of create layers from where you're going to park to where you're going to later be inside, and then out and into what I was talking about before, the untrammeled, the wilderness. So that's another one of my groups, and that's all I have right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lori. You know, my first when I first came to Montana quite a long time ago, more than 20 years ago, and I actually lived in one of the Pine Creek cabins, which is about 2 miles from that spot. Yeah. We have time for a couple of questions. If we have anyone has questions for Lori, I know she'll be here to chat for a bit after. If Karen?
I just wonder about the collaborative process of making the design choices. How did you get them to work together in that way? And also the work ethic is a little different between. I was wondering about the work ethic between the students and also the collaborative process of coming up with design ideas and how you facilitated that.
With the students, you mean, right? Well, the way that I start out the process, because there's kind of a large, I mean, it's hard to deal with 9 to 12 students all in kind of consensus. So what we do first is I break them into groups of 3, and they each group has to develop a design proposal, and then they present to each other. And I talk to them a lot beforehand about how it's not going to work if they bring their egos. That it has to be about really looking at what the proposals are and understanding what's positive about them, what's good about them, what's going to be affordable, what's buildable, you know, all of these things. And so I just try to prepare them and say, you guys might look at 3 proposals and realize that one of them is it, you know, just hands down. Or you might look at it and realize that each of them has great parts, but you can't really Frankenstein it together, so you kind of have to go, yeah, these are all great, and then you kind of step away from it for a little bit and then come back and think about how you're going to put the ideas together. So the first part basically is that. And as far as work ethic, I mean, architects are workhorses, so. And out there, they realize, they know that they are going to be building it. They know it's their project. They know that they are going to be able to bring their parents or their grandparents or their kids at some point to come back and see these things. And they are very invigorated in the idea of being able to give something to the community.
Another question? Okay, well, thanks very much, Lori. That was terrific. Appreciate it. So for our last session, we have one more session which is also on the kind of theme of creativity, really, and looking forward and stimulating creativity and thought. Before we start that, I did want to mention a couple of little announcements. First of all, Roger Millard asked me to let you all know about the Envision Missoula Long-Range Transportation Plan forums that are happening, public workshops on Tuesday the 13th of November, Wednesday the 14th, and Thursday the 15th of November, which will be at the University Center Ballroom, so that's a good way to get involved in some of the things we've been talking about over the last couple days. I also did want to thank a couple more people again, Lucia Stewart, especially the conference organizer, Michael Gardner, who's here and had the unenviable job of assembling all the PowerPoint. Tony Galarza from the Hilton here did a great job with the AV, and Colin Hickey, who actually has left, but he was the stage manager in helping me keep everything smooth, so I really appreciate that. I know that this is always a terrible thing to ask, an audience, but if any of you are sort of so inclined and able, sitting in the back, if you could move up a little bit, because this is going to be a kind of a very collegial and fun panel, and it's always easier to do that if people are a little closer together, so I won't beat on you about that, but if you have a choice, please sit a little further forward. So the last group, we have a good eclectic mix on this panel. We have from Gary Ferguson, who's a writer from Red Lodge, has written a number of books about a number of issues relating to the West and wildlife and wilderness and also development and as it pertains to the West. Peter Stark, who is also a writer and an entrepreneur in the forest products business these days as well, which is an interesting combination. Jonathan Schechter, and Jonathan is an economist out of Jackson who has done some very creative work on mountain towns and communities and how they can develop in a positive way. And then Steve Loken, who is a builder and I guess advocate for all things great and good in Missoula. And so we should have quite a lively panel. So if you could all come up and we'll get started. I think there is an order according to those name tags there. So Steve, you're at the end, Peter next, Gary, and then John. So this is kind of an eclectic group, and we put this under the rubric of sort of imagining the New West, and we're really trying to kind of end the conference here with some kind of creative possibilities of things that we could do, and things that we can imagine that would make this place great, and that's obviously in the context of development, but also in the general context of livable communities and sustainability and all the other themes we've been talking about. So I thought I'd start with Steve, and I know you have a lot of strong ideas about the kinds of things we should be doing, particularly here in Missoula, but more generally in Western Montana. So why don't you kind of synthesize a little maybe and share some of your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Jonathan. Rats. I thought I was going to be last. Well, after 2 days of pretty interesting presentations and a lot of thought-provoking stuff, I was charged with this group to talk about imagining the New West and where do we go from here. So all of us, I guess, have to have this interesting opportunity to just give those comments to you and then either radicalize you, get you really pissed off, or make you
No, it's supposed to be upbeat, Steve.
That's what I'm saying. Upbeat can be very pissy sometimes. I was really impressed with a lot of different panels today, but I wanted to kind of break down what I think could be happening in the New West and imagining what Montana could be 50 years from now. And two components to that is rural and urban. even though much of this conversation that we've been having the last 2 days has been about the fringe, been about suburbs, been about exploiting the areas around metropolitan areas. I think that all is part and parcel to why we're here, what we love to sell, what we love to build, and how I think cities and ruralscapes will look 50 years from now. And we got a really good bunch of guys up here to talk about all the individual slices within that context. So I just kind of wrote a quick summary up here for rural Montana. I have lived in rural Montana, I've worked in rural Montana, I've tried to survive in rural Montana myself. And listening to the panel today and listening to their unique challenges and problems and opportunities made me think more about including that in this imagining the next 50 years. So I wanted to put out these things that I think will be happening, and it's all open to debate, of course, by all of you. But I think, first of all, the biggest challenge for Montana is keeping farms and ranches at all. Maybe, just maybe, we're at a point with climate change, drought, and changing conditions where the ag land that we've known and trusted in the past may not be able to substantively maintain itself as agricultural land, or we continue to beat it down until it's all gone. Topsoil in Montana is very thin. Rainfall is very rare. Specialty crops have been tried. Some succeed, others fail. I'm just asking the question, will Montana continue to be a rural state in the future? And will we be able to sustain the topsoil and farmland over the long haul to continue to do that? We pound the ground now with herbicides, pesticides, water, saline seep, and all the other things that are trying to keep these guys alive. So I'm just asking the question, if we're going to continue to do agriculture in rural Montana, we're going to have to, I think, figure out a much better and different way to do it and to keep these people out there and trying to let some communities go because they will not be able to be sustainable communities and let other ones thrive. Some of these small communities don't have rivers for floating, mountains to climb, and hills to snowboard down. So what will they be and who will be out there? That's the question I'm asking. I think we're also going to find that the specialty crops that we've had in the past, like kamut, lentils and canola and some of these things, I think they really do have a good marketplace. But Montana, like many other western dry agricultural states, are faced with globalization. Right now, one of the only reasons the wheat crop is up so high, commodity market in Chicago and internationally has a 30-day supply of wheat. If they go less than 30 days for the wheat supply for the world, prices go up. So this summer and this fall, international wheat storage was only 11 days. So wheat prices went through the roof. These guys are doing good right now. Whether or not that will happen, if we'll get wheat storage commodity levels less than 30 days in the future is just speculation. The other amenities I think that we need to explore over the next 50 years for agricultural land in Montana, it wasn't agricultural before we got here. What was it? How did it have its own natural ecological integrity and biodiversity to sustain itself as it was? There are some interesting challenges and movements in the United States and Canada right now, some of which I like to call the Wild Farm Alliance. And outfits like this are trying to take hard farms that are trying to make it and softening up the fringes and understanding the natural biodiversity of the fringes of the farms. And if we can begin having or paying farmers and ranchers to let the fringe go wild, let the fringe go native, and pay them for maintaining or enhancing that natural ecological diversity, it could be a way of keeping and or revitalizing rural areas. We also have other organizations like the American Prairie Foundation, the Nature Conservancy, and other things, but you can't just buy them and let them hang out. You have to buy them and then steward them. And we're losing a source of stewards for these large ranches and farms in Montana. The average age, I think, in the Midwest is about 69 years old. These guys are not young and tough anymore. And unless we figure out a way to bring new people or give the opportunity for new, younger people to come onto ranches and farms, understand those agronomy systems and steward the land and pay them to do it. The state could convert some of their state lands to ranches and farms so the new young farmers had a place to start. and they didn't have to compete against the speculators and the realtors that would pay top dollar for it, that would be a good place to maintain, I think, an agricultural legacy, so we actually have people who know how the hell to fix a combine or how to hitch up a plow, because those are going to be important skill sets to have if we want to feed ourselves. The other thing that I think is interesting in the whole venue of carbon and carbon sequestration and global warming, there are Carbon Farmers of America right now, and it's a whole consortium of farmers who think with the right crops, even growing them in Montana, you can sequester carbon in the soil. This could be a whole new thing with the Chicago carbon trading market that could allow Montana farmers and ranchers to find a whole new venue to sequester some of the world's or some of the nation's carbon in the soil or in crops. The legacy opportunity I talked about, I think, is extremely important to the future of Montana's agriculture in rural areas. And how we do that and how we initiate the dialogue to do that, I think, in the state is going to be a really important question. And I don't think we should just look to Brian Schweitzer for leadership here. I think all of us need to talk about it for all the land that we know and love that actually does produce some crop right now. I also think I'd like to also say to finance this stuff, because this is all visionary stuff for the next 50 years, we're broke. State has no money for anything. We're broke. We're the second lowest per capita income state in the nation, right down there with Mississippi. Oh, great, Mississippi. And we consistently refuse in this state to sell what we have. What we have is beauty, we have grandeur, we have open space. It's unparalleled in the West. And everybody comes to eat our scenery. They come prepared. They open their pocketbooks to pay us sales tax. We don't ask. How dumb does that get? We don't even ask. A few small municipalities in the state have a bed tax. Oh, that's pretty good. That's a good way to start. Whitefish has made millions on their bed tax. Red Lodge, I think, has one. We're talking about it here in Missoula. But I say get the revenue from the people who have it, and like Robin Hood, equalize the wealth so this state has some legacy of money left to make some of these changes. The last thing we do have that we can sell is our coal. 500 loaded coal cars go east every day, and 500 loaded coal cars go west every day from this state. 1,000 of them leave every day. We had a 28% severance tax on coal in this state 28 years ago. Now it's down to 11%. We keep giving away the farm. Coal is worth more now than it's ever been worth. We have very low sulfur coal. It's very valuable. We're giving it away. Coal companies have dropped their employment. They don't have very many people working. It's all mechanized. So they're making a lot of money. We're not making much, and they're leaving big holes in the ground and leaving us with methane gas to deal with. That's not a good way to run a state when the revenue that we have is going away that fast. The other thing is, I still believe strongly in a real estate transaction tax to fund some of the things I'm talking about, both in rural and urban. And I think that real estate transaction tax is important because we no longer have sawmills that operate. Most of our minerals are gone. The coal is going rapidly, and we're giving that away. And the one thing that we have left is the perception of value in land. And the guys that sell it over and over again are making pretty good money selling the land. People will pay top dollar to buy the land. I think we should have anything over $250,000 should have a 0.5% real estate transaction tax. That goes into a fund to help plan for and help change the next 50 years and how Montana survives, or much of what we know and love today will simply be gone. That's rural. I'm done with that. I think rural should stay rural, urban should stay urban, and that leaves us with the suburbs, and I'm going to let these guys talk about the suburbs. But urban, I'm just going to throw a couple of quick things out because I don't think this conference has talked about urban very much, and I think urban is where the action is. I really do. Urban is where brains are, where capital exists, and where technology exists. That's where cities really kind of leave us to the future. They're growing. They have to grow smarter and better. In the last 20 years, from 1970 to 1990, 82% of the growth in the United States occurred in cities. They're projecting the next 20 years, this is mind-boggling, the next 20 years in the United States, 80% of the population in the United States will live within 100 miles of the seacoast. So what happens in Montana to our cities, I think is going to be really important. These demographics are changing. The boomers are getting older. They're not going to want to mow knapweed in the Bitterroot Valley 20 years from now. They're probably going to want to come to a place where there's culture, where there's entertainment, and where there's like-minded people to hang out with. As the boomers age, watch the demographic demands change for what we need to do. And it will not be living in a ranchette in the Bitterroot Valley, I don't think. With those demographic changes, I think cities like Don MacArthur mentioned earlier will really need to face how they can address ecology, the challenge of urban ecology. Cities are amazing organisms. They produce nutrients, waste, they can capture water, they have to deal with transportation, and they can make their own energy. There are cities I visited in Scandinavia and in Europe that do many parts of this much better than we do in the United States. So think about, as Roger Miller mentioned to me today at lunch, the zoning in Missoula right now will allow 48,000 more people to live within the city limits of Missoula, just the way it is now. Now that means totally remaking the way Missoula looks. But I think if Missoula wasn't designed for architecture and was instead designed for people, this could be a thriving and rich city, but it would be taller. Cities need to grow up. Like teenagers need to turn into young adults, small young western cities need to mature and grow up. And in doing so, they'll preserve the fringe and preserve a lot of the land around them that could sustain them for their water, their food, fuel, and fiber in the future. I also think that we need to look at our rivers. Right now, I know all of you out there think rivers are great for fly fishing, but they're going to be gone. It's the most precious resource we have is flowing water. And if we all like it, then we got to protect it. We can't even pass stream-side setback legislation in this state, a lousy 500 feet away from the stream. That's why you see big log cabins and mega mansions right next to the water, so it's an easy cast. Whew. But I enjoy those rivers. I think they're mine. I think they're yours. And we should all make sure that we can figure out a way to preserve them and hold them in high esteem. I just got a news flash at noon today. The federal government said Patty Canyon, Blue Mountain, and the Upper Rattlesnake were being privatized and going to be sold. Any takers? Because if we get big and if we grow and the projections for population growth occur like they're saying in western Montana, what do we do with this great 70 to 80% of public land that we have around here that we value so much? The feds may decide to sell it. And there goes the great amenities that we have. Maybe in 50 years we'll figure out how to use land better and smarter so Patty Canyon, Blue Mountain, and the Upper Rattlesnake won't be built on the way we're building today. Parceling it out, herbiciding it, fencing it, and putting big houses there. We got to figure out a way to do this differently. And the last thing I want to say is affordable housing. I know everybody's talked about this. Anybody been to East Missoula lately? Downtown East Missoula? I always thought it could be such a great little satellite community to Missoula. I really did. Until I was over there just a couple months ago, and downtown East Missoula has got, 300 mini storage units, brand new. That's the downtown of East Missoula, the satellite community for taking growth away from Missoula. So my idea was to take all the mini storage in western Montana, the Bitterroot Valley, East Missoula, take all the mini storage and turn it into affordable housing. Okay, that's it for
Well,
me.
Steve, that was the gloomiest upbeat presentation I have ever heard.
I offered
We're gonna
solutions.
sell off the national forest. I mean, I don't think that's really something we have to worry about in particular. But anyway, in general, I do appreciate your points. Gary, you've been working on a book that actually has to do with development and how development over in America in general has kind of evolved and shaped the country and how nature fit into that. Maybe if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the book I was specifically asked to do has to do with a man named John Ripley Forbes, who just passed away a year ago at the age of 93. And what I wanted to tell you about John, and he was not a relation to the famous Forbes family. He was actually of quite modest means. But the world he was born into is something to take a close look at, I think, in our last session here, because it has a lot to do with the kind of hungers and urges that the people who are coming to Montana, why they're coming, what they're looking for. And specifically, John Ripley Forbes was born in 1913 in the throes of what was, without question, the biggest, most enthusiastic nature obsession in not only American history, but I would argue in the developed world. The New York Times, Century Magazine, at the time called those first 20 years of the 20th century a cult, which at the time meant more like a movement, like no other in the world. And there were two things that were going on in those first 2 decades in the United States. One was just simply the wake of what had been so important as a concept of nature in forming who we were as an American people. At the time Lewis and Clark were passing through this area on their way to the Pacific in the early 1800s, there was a wonderful and absolutely widespread conversation going on among Orthodox and progressive clergy all up and down the East Coast and certainly throughout New England. And the conversation was, well, is nature the hand and voice of God, or is nature God himself? That sounds like something maybe Shirley MacLaine might have asked in the 70s, but in fact, no, it was a critical part of how we were thinking about ourselves. Abigail Van Buren, 20 years prior, had said, we will produce more artists and more musicians and painters than any other country in the world because of all the time we spend in this country rubbing elbows with the woods. When the Civil War broke out, there was a pretty significant little movement to prune our national tree, which was an American elm, back to stubs, to show our state of moral decline, that we would actually take up guns and kill our fellow citizens. We, for 140 years, thought of ourselves in terms of the symbology of the natural world. When John Ripley Forbes was born in 1913, it was an era when naturalists like John Burroughs were rock stars. John Burroughs and Ernest Thompson Seton could barely travel by train without getting to a platform and finding 200 and 300 school children waiting for them, holding signs, "We love you, John, we love you, Ernest." The Boy Scout Handbook, basically from 1915 to about 1930, outsold every single book in the country except the Bible. We were absolutely on fire with the concept of nature. School gardens were proliferating. I mean, that's a big thing again right now, started in California to some extent by Alice Waters in Berkeley and spreading throughout the country. Certainly a great presence here in Missoula. That was a big deal back in 1906, 1907, and 1908. 3,000 gardens spreading across the country in just a matter of a few years, mostly to keep nature planted in children's lives, to use it as a teaching tool, which of course it became a very popular teaching tool, not just back then, but in the 70s and 80s, and again with environmental education. But John Ripley Forbes was born in the wake of all this enthusiasm that had long been a part of who we were as a culture. But he was also born in the throes of a great anguish that was developing, and that anguish was, if that's such an incredibly important component of who we are as a people, who will we be when it's gone? And so John Ripley Forbes devoted basically his life to trying to figure out how to bring the nature experience and the concept and the perception of nature to an urban world, to an urban country. And across the next basically 70 years of his life, he planted portals, if you will, around the country in urban areas mostly that served as places for children to have their early experiences of nature within the urban zone, and also as community gathering spaces. He started 263 primary nature centers in cities around the country, from Portland and Dallas and Sacramento and Chicago and New York, most of them still standing and most thriving today. Putting those nature centers in place, again, to bring children into that notion of nature having an importance. He did this against, by the way, other players doing much the same thing. Harvard and Yale in 1913 suggested that they should start, a group of academics were going to start colleges of the wilderness through both Harvard and Yale, because they were so afraid of the concept of wilderness eking and leaking out of American consciousness and what that would do to us as a people. I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but one of the things they were particularly concerned about had to do with what was referred to at the time as a consciousness of freedom. Henry George, best-selling author in the 1890s, said, it doesn't make any difference if anybody comes to these places out west, these preserves like Yellowstone and the various forest preserves that were being created. Said it didn't matter at all. Just keeping them, just knowing they were there was critical to our consciousness of freedom. What he was talking about is the fact that for a long time, wilderness through the 1700s was referred to as the great equalizer. If we all go out into the Yellowstone bottomlands tomorrow and some sow grizzly thrashes through the willows and we run into her face to face, she's not going to care which of us has the bluest blood, who has the most money in their bank account. She's going to swat whoever she feels like. They understood through living close to nature after 200 years that it tends to bestow its dangers and its blessings equally. So it was no surprise that the Hudson River School emerged painting these beautiful wilderness paintings, not just for the scenic value, but to remind the culture of the value of having and maintaining wilderness. Forbes was building on that, trying to keep a notion of nature within the cities. The thing that Forbes ended up doing when he was in his 70s is turning a lot of his attention to preservation. Preservation of lands that were within the urban corridor that had been abandoned. They were maybe shopping centers or other things at one time, and in some cases old growth, but that by some miracle hadn't necessarily been cut down in the east. So, for instance, in Atlanta in 1993, established the Big Trees Forest Preserve. He established Lake Carico, which is within the urban center of Atlanta, and they are considered semi-wild preserves, and this has now caught on throughout the East, these semi-wild urban preserves. There's one big developer, Charlie Roberts, who's owner of Roberts Properties, Fortune 500 company. He's a billionaire. He got Forbes' religion. He came to know John Forbes very well in the last few years of his life. He's going right now in Florida and in Georgia and in various places in the Northeast. He's finding these old shopping centers that have been abandoned, these box stores that have outlived their usefulness. He's tearing them down. He's ripping up all the asphalt. He's hauling it away, and he's planting trees and making forested parks out of them, based on what John Ripley Forbes said was a critical aspect of the quality of life of living in the city. These kinds of benefits of having nature in the city, some of you may have heard of Richard Lou's latest book, Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. And his book has become a phenomenon. He's so busy speaking across the country right now that he had to start his own speakers bureau to handle the requests. And basically, Louvre was recapping what John Ripley Forbes had discovered, along with others in the 20s and 30s, that kids who grow up having some kind of green space in their background tend to, especially between the ages of 4 to 7, because of the number of variables in a natural environment, their brain, their neurons, the actual formation of their neurons that are associated with the quality of inventiveness or creative thinking, tend to be superior in those kids who have had green space in their past. Now scientists are documenting, and they have been for the last 10 years, that kids who have some regular dose of green space also tend to have much more moderated levels of ADD, attention deficit disorder. So those kinds of things that Forbes and others knew back in the 20s and 30s are being rediscovered now. These are the qualities that we're stumping for and that we're saying are important. This isn't just a matter of scenery. It isn't just a matter of, well, you save the land because that's going to earn the biggest buck from the subdivision around that open space. It's really, literally, and it has been for most of this country's history, considered an essential aspect of what makes it possible to live well in the world. One of the things I'm a little bit concerned with is I think in the West we've done a very, very good job of relating to wilderness and nature in general as individuals. It's where we go to play, it's where we go to get inspired, it's where people like me go to, find their muse to write books, and many of you go to journal and to just chill out from the stress of your daily life. We've done real well relating to the West as individuals. What we've not done nearly as well is to relate to nature as a community. And as those kinds of values get expressed as a value of our community, we will find, I think, a very different kind of mindset evolving. What Lori said earlier, the word mindfulness, I think that what I see and have perceived over the last 15 or 20 years as a hunger for place, and I think there's such an intense hunger of place in this country that it's almost hard to measure. I think what it really is a hunger for mindfulness. And so those developers and those people like those fine men I'm sharing this panel with who are doing products that tend to suggest a kind of mindfulness, a developer that has a certain mindfulness to his development, you will see, I think, a remarkable response in the community. Those of you who were here this morning and saw Brent Moore show the slide of Red Lodge Cafe Regis, I own half of that cafe. A bunch of friends and I bought it to save it from the bulldozer. It was supposed to be mowed down. It was built in 1941 to put a parking lot in for the high school. And we saved it, and we've put a lot of effort into alternative energy. We've got solar panels, we've got organic gardens that grow the food for the cafe, we've got composting, we've got recycling. Nothing new to the Missoula community, but it was a big new kind of direction for Red Lodge. And the support that we've had has been tremendous. People showing up and basically asking if we need money to do these things like solar panels and other things we're doing. They want to be a part of something that suggests a deeper and more meaningful and more mindful way of being in the world and being in their communities. So I think there's great optimism to that extent, that the more we reach that critical mass, where that's not the norm because it's just politically correct thing to do, but because it's an act of expressing what we value in the world around us, I think the more successful we're probably going to be. So I think I'll just stop there.
And how do you think what would Forbes's lesson to us today be? I mean, how would you think we're doing, and what should we do in terms of integrating nature into the way that we think of ourselves?
I think he would probably suggest that we should approach development under the, I guess I'd put the term conservation first. Go out to the extent, because in this area we do still have open space. It's not like working within the city limits of Atlanta or Jacksonville, Florida, or something like that. But he would say, with that conservation first principle, find, with the help of good scientific research, with the help of public input, find those things that are absolutely critical to your city or your county or your region that you can't lose. Migration corridors, winter range for elk, other things that whatever the community feels are valuable, and acquire those particular resources and make the development subservient to that layer of conservation and that layer of identifying what's important. He would also, and one of the things he was a miracle worker at, he would also say, make those people, or encourage those people, he was very persuasive, who have the money to contribute to those things. Maybe it would be a transfer tax or real estate tax that helps acquire those lands. But he was also incredible. Sometimes right as the bulldozers were about to start destroying some of these urban areas that became these semi-wild urban preserves, he was able to, in some cases within 10 days, raise $7 and $8 million. Just by taking the attitude that the people who have money, he was doing a great favor to them by showing them how they could spend that money on something that would be meaningful for generations to come. He felt it was a privilege for them to come across him begging for money because he was showing them what to do with that money that would give them a sense of legacy and a sense of meaning that they didn't have if they didn't participate. So I think he would say, rattle the bushes, pass the kinds of legislations you need to get money to secure those kinds of natural areas, and then build community gathering spaces that are not just exclusive, but that they invite the schools, they invite people of all economic means, and they are accessible to people of all economic means. He spent a lot of his time building some of these semi-wild urban preserves right in the heart of the most impoverished socioeconomically areas in the cities of the East.
Thanks. John, a lot of your work focuses on mountain towns and the economies thereof and the evolution thereof, and they also happen to be places where there are a lot of wealthy people. And I know that some of your work has sort of been about that in a way, getting the kind of economic engines of those communities to contribute to the conservation in a way that maybe relates a little bit to what Gary's talking about. Is that a fair characterization, and how's that going?
You told me you were going to ask me when I stopped beating my wife, and that was a lot easier question than the one you just posed. First of all, I'm not from Montana, and I feel like I owe you an apology because I'm not from Montana. I was talking the last couple of days in Vermont, and it felt the same way. There's obviously a tremendous pride of place that people in Montana feel for their state, and it's something very palpable and something that there's an old vaudeville saying about you shouldn't follow an act featuring kids or dogs, and I feel like I shouldn't be asked to speak after you two talking so eloquently about what makes your communities and this world so special. So with that as a prelude, geez, John,
I thought it was a softball. You know,
Well,
1% for the Tetons.
oh, okay.
Tell us
Well,
about that.
why don't you tell us about what I do? What John's alluding to, I run an organization called the Chartour Institute, and I formed it about 6 years ago after going around and spending a lot of time in resort communities, national park gateway communities, just generally beautiful places. And I noticed that they seemed to have a few traits in common. One was that they were geographically isolated from one another. They all seemed to be undergoing tremendous strains from growth for reasons that they didn't really understand, and they were working so hard to try and deal with that they didn't have time to do much of anything except basically cope. And there was also, in a lot of these places, a hopeless narcissism, which is really preventing them from learning from one another because, you know, Aspen's nice, but it's not Jackson Hole, that kind of thing. And so because we all felt these communities all felt an inherent superiority to one another, it was hard for them to learn. So I put together my organization to try and research and understand something that just didn't make any sense to me, which was ostensibly that these were tourism-oriented communities, whether they were national park gateways or summer resorts like Nantucket or ski areas. But an interesting thing has been going on. If you look at the ski industry today as opposed to 15 years ago, basically skier days are flat. If you look at national park visitations 15 years ago versus today, national park visitations are down 10 to 15%. And so the question was, what's going on? Because if this is the economic engine driving these communities, we have a real problem in reconciling something that was going on in a lot of these communities, like 60% population growth in 10 years, doubling, tripling of housing prices, huge increases in income, and threats to what these places perceive to be their community character. So I formed my organization to research that. And after a few years, I came up with some theories and presented those last year at this conference. The second part of that, though, was information in and of itself without action is a wasted resource. So I developed a process called Sustaining Jackson Hole, in which I tried to help my community identify those qualities that really mattered to it, and then secondly, do something about it to preserve those qualities for future generations. With that as a setup, John's question was getting at something that started to threaten to erode the quality of my Sustaining Jackson Hole program, which was this. I was asking people who care desperately about their communities. Most people live in Jackson Hole because they want to, not because they have to. Not too many people put a gun to somebody's head and said, you have to move to Jackson Hole. And in a very different way from, say, traditional American manufacturing jobs, most people have chosen to live there because they can, and not because they work there. They work there, they move there and they figure out something to do, or else they bring their job with them. And so I was asking people to volunteer in Sustaining Jackson Hole to help them come to talk about their community, about things they really deeply cared about. And that made them very, very vulnerable, because they were opening themselves up and saying, this is what I care about, this is what moves me about my community, this is what I want to sustain for future generations. And in order to honor that, what I was realizing was that they were opening themselves up, they were making it very clear that they cared and they wanted to do something, and they would come up with some really good ideas. The speaker right before us was talking about how I think people are motivated by creativity comes from that place of love and caring. This is what this process was allowing to come to the surface. But unfortunately, because the community is growing so rapidly and dealing with such issues of growth, there's not a lot of money to go around to deal with issues that are 5, 10, 15 years over the horizon, stuff that people really care about, or small innovative ideas that if we can do them today will have a big difference in the future. So what I did about a year and a half ago was start a program called 1% for the Tetons, wherein my member businesses, and I have about 55 of them right now, donate 1% of their gross sales to my organization. We aggregate that money and we turn around and we grant it to local nonprofits which are applying for grants to do projects related to long-term sustainability issues. And in our first year, we were able to grant out a little over $100,000 from those 55 businesses. So they grossed a little over $10 million between them. And what we're trying to do with that money is encourage projects that focus on long-term sustainability that otherwise are not being funded, and focus on challenges that my community faces and opportunities we have in our hands are not within single disciplines, single jurisdictions, single silos. And so we try to use that money to encourage organizations to work in collaboration. We had, of the 10 grants that we gave out this year, it represented some 75 organizations working on these 10 different projects. So we're trying to use it as a little bit of social engineering to try and get organizations to think differently and act differently than they otherwise would. And everything has to have some sort of hook into our basic philosophical principle, which is in our community we feel that all of our essential qualities, our economy, our character, the way we are, why people are attracted to it, flow from the environment. So every project that we fund has to have some little hook into the environment, however tenuous.
That's good. Thanks, John. Peter, you come at these things from two different angles, both as a writer for Outside Magazine and a writer about outdoor issues, and also now as an entrepreneur, kind of trying to make a buck doing some sustainable things in the outdoors. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about how you come at these sort of questions of nature and wilderness from each of those perspectives.
Well, I was sitting up here and thinking, I'm exactly in the right spot between Gary and Steve, because I'm a writer like Gary, and I'm working on a book about the empty spaces in the United States that touches on some of the themes that he was just bringing up. And then I look over at Steve Loken, and what I've realized that my day job now is as a writer, and I'm an aspiring flooring salesman. And when it's a particularly bad week like this week, I can look over at Steve Loken and say, now there's one guy who got me into this whole thing to begin with. It was starting in about 94, when we were thinking of building a house way in the upper Rattlesnake, and Steve was into the sustainable use of materials way ahead of a lot of other people. And
why don't you tell us that story?
well,
I'll give you
just the really. I'll try to do the 25-word or less version, but I don't know. In the late '80s, my wife and I bought 80 acres of land up there when it was cheap, and we were, was a tree-hugging eco-liberal. I wasn't going to touch a single branch of the trees of the forest, steeply wooded forest, and we were going to build a house. Then it became clear that we weren't going to have enough money to build a house. Then it became clear, after I took a forestry stewardship course, that this beautiful forest that I thought we had was actually this really incredibly sick forest that had 837 trees per acre when it's supposed to have about 10. And it became clear we needed to restore the forest, we had to thin it in some way, which was very expensive to do. And we finally worked with a forester, Matt Arno of Woodland Restoration, who's an expert at this restoration work. And what you realize is that there are these beautiful trees that are 6 inches in diameter and 100 years old. And the highest use for them is at the pulp mill, or burning in a slash pile with this beautiful grain, very tight growth rings. So I started looking around thinking, okay, how can you use those trees? And I literally called up the Japanese embassy and said, you guys want some post and beam houses out of these beautiful trees? Go up there with Matt, and he'd look at his head and he'd say, wow, I don't know, this looks like a really difficult steep slope, a lot of work, it's going to be expensive. I'd say, well, I keep thinking, maybe we can sell them for like chopsticks, and look up and say, well, they better need about 1 billion chopsticks. And he'd look again, no, make that 10 billion. So anyway, the short of it is that I wrote a book that made some money. My wife's a modern dancer. We were building a dance studio in our backyard for her, and we were pricing out the floor, and it was so expensive to buy a hardwood floor. And I started thinking, oh, we have all these skinny little larch trees, and I'd heard that larch makes beautiful flooring, and we had it milled by a little mill down in Dillon and installed in the dance studio, and it was this beautiful floor that instantly attracted the interest of architects and designers and the Forest Service and the timber industry, and then Outside Magazine asked me to write an essay about it. And one thing led to another, and the next thing I knew, I was in business with Matt Arno, the forest restoration guy. We have a little company called North Slope Sustainable Wood, and we make a flooring called Treadlight, and our motto, we're restoring the forest. We're taking those skinny little trees and making them into, we're leaving the big ones and making that into flooring. And our little tagline is new floors restoring old growth. I got into this because I was thinking of the future of the West and my own future to some degree, but I was really driven by ideology and a passion was that, if you can find a way to use the skinny little trees and sell them for high value and leave the big ones, leaving the big ones will make the environmentalists happy, selling the skinny little ones will make the timber industry happy, and maybe we can get past this stalemate we've had for 20 years between the timber industry and the environmental movement. So that's what got me all hepped up on this job, on this little idea, and now it's kind of taken off. But then after a particularly bad week, I start thinking, man, this is, it's a long, hard slog. It's going to be a long, long way. And so when Steve starts talking about 50 years, I was, coming over to the conference thinking, what's the message that I want to bring? And when Gary talks about Forbes, this is 80 years ago he was doing his work, and John's looking way down the road economically. You're talking 10 or 15 years down the road in Jackson Hole. I was thinking on the way over here, we're looking a century down the road. I mean, that's the way we have to start thinking about these things. And maybe this has been a theme that's come up again and again. I haven't been at the I've been to a couple of earlier sessions, but I was out trying to sell wood most of the time. But it's really the long view that we have to look towards. And looking for these, I don't particularly want to hold up our little company as an example, but these ideas where you're taking the resource that you have at your disposal and finding a way to make it economically viable. And I know there are hundreds more ideas like that out there, but it's finding them, and it's also coming up with a way to somehow, you were saying about, people come here and they eat our scenery. How do we create this sort of brand, this idea? There's something that we need to export in the Northern Rockies that we haven't really tapped into, other than, inviting people here. But there's something that we need to get together to export, and I'm not sure what it is.
What do you mean, like an idea or a product or a sensibility?
It might be the sensibility. That I heard Lori speaking in the session before this about mindfulness, and maybe that's what we're exporting in some way. We're packaging. I mean, literally, this is the marketeer in me, packaging that mindfulness that, that you can take part in this beautiful place where that we all know and love here in this room, and other people can take part in it from other parts of the country or parts of the world, and the people who live here can take part in it. But you have to buy into this idea of mindfulness. Or you don't have to, but here it is. Here's this product. Here's this thing that we're offering you, and how to make that work economically, I don't know. I just have this gut feeling that that's the way we should be thinking in the 100-year vision.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great thought, and one of the things that has come up in different ways in over the course of the couple days is that these are very long-term issues. We talk about the growth of Missoula, and we have a chart. 50 years from now, what's it going to look like? And it's intrinsically extremely difficult for people to kind of wrap their arms around, thinking 50 years ahead or 100 years ahead. And in fact, it's even kind of it's more than counterintuitive. It's almost self-destructive in a way. I mean, you're not going to be around in 50 years, so why should you worry about that? And so to kind of think about that, I like that notion of mindfulness and how that, can kind of be an ethic that can carry forward that long-term thinking, if that makes any sense. Steve, do you have a thought about that?
Yeah, that's really depressing, Jonathan. That's really depressing because I think the problem that we're in is the immediacy of every day, that we try to make it to the end of the day with our jobs and our families and our driving. And I have found, I've lectured quite a bit at the environmental studies and over at the university, both universities, and I am amazed at the zeal young college students have in this state for making a difference, for making things better. And they're not asked, they're not compelled, but boy, they really want to contribute. Like you were saying, Gary, I think they know that this is not Cincinnati, this is not Oklahoma, and they're here and they recognize it's a very special place. And I think in that specialness, they want to really find a way and an opportunity to contribute, like in what Peter's been doing with his business, small diameter utilization. The forests, many of them that we have in western Montana, are sick. They need stewardship. They need recognition. And in that demand is a huge opportunity to put a lot of young adults to work, making a difference and understanding the difference. I am, however, responding to Gary's comments about the book Richard Louv wrote, Last Child in the Woods. You should read it. It's a very sobering book. And it's sobering because we are not giving kids an opportunity to be outdoors. The president of REI, did you see that just a few weeks ago? The president, CEO for REI was here in Missoula, and they asked her what her biggest competition was with all of their REI stores. And the first thing you think about is Bob Ward's, Sportsman's Warehouse. She said, our biggest competition is Staples and Best Buy, because they sell electronic things. And electronic things keep our kids from going outdoors, keep them from buying outdoor equipment or skis or experiencing outdoors. That was one of the most profound things I'd ever heard. That was her competition, was electronics. So unless we engage the youth of this country, because that's 50 years from now, unless we engage the youth in this country in stewardship and in fostering natural resource connections, ranching, farming, forestry, all these things, I don't think Montana's going to be the same place. Even though we will become urban, I think we can become urban in a really wise way and do this urban ecology and get the kids involved, which will be young adults, to make our cities work better and smarter. But I really think they just need to be asked. And we need to have a national service program in this country that gets kids out like the CCC and the WPA used to be. I think the future of our natural resources depends on a whole bunch of young people engaging in it, understanding it, and making a contribution with it.
Yeah, can I just interject something that really struck home with me, because I am traveling around a fair amount now and going to various green building gatherings and whatnot, and that I think there is this tremendous enthusiasm among that younger generation, not only in Montana but other parts of the country. That college generation is much more conscientious about how they live in a daily way. Not everybody, but a certain percentage of them. And that's where, that's something I find really encouraging, is that there's a generation coming up that does have some of that very conscientious aspect, but then there's also the video generation at the same time.
John, do you see in the kinds of people who support your work, do you see that generational thing at all?
Clearly, the median, it's impossible to gauge it with any accuracy, but it's a pretty interesting deal, because we have 50 some odd businesses, each of which are small individual owners. It isn't going to work. We're not going to get the Staples in Jackson Hole to join 1% for the Tetons. But so it's somebody owns a bagel store, or somebody owns a marketing firm or something like that. But my demographic skews really young. And what's particularly interesting about that is that I'll go up to some guy in his 60s, say 50s, 60s, who's been around for 20, 30 years. Basically, when Jackson was a tourism economy, when that was really the engine driving its growth, which it no longer is. And that person, for whatever reason, basically refuses to join. And, there's a great harumph, and it's, well, what are you going to do with the money? And there are a million reasons not to join. And I've had literally 3 conversations where I've gone up to somebody who's in their 30s or 40s, computer consulting business, marketing, what have you, and I'll say, 1% for the Tetons, what do you think? And they go, sounds great, I'm in. What is it? Because it's resonating at this visceral level. People, they came to that place, they've kind of gotten over their yo, bro, bra, kind of, I'm here to ski, I'm here to party, and they've made the investment in the community, and they're there, and it's their place. And what is very hard in any of these places that are rapidly growing is to find a way to channel in a positive sense the passion you have for your community. We all get into great fisticuffs over, well, should that be a strip mall over there? Should be a little pocket park or what have you? Those are all contentious, and there really aren't very good ways within our culture, within our towns, to channel the positive energy you have for a place. And it's very easy for business owners. It hurts to write a check for 1%, but they start crying when they do it out of joy because it's something that they're doing positively for a place they love. And as I say, that tends to skew young in my experience.
Okay, well, we're about at the end here, and I think to pick up on a few of these themes, I'm going to end with one sort of simple but very difficult question, which is on these 2 themes of sort of engendering mindfulness and particularly kind of stimulating what I think everyone has agreed is a kind of a consciousness and latent mindfulness on the part of kids and young people. What would be one thing that we could do? What would be one practical thing that we could do here or in your community or in Missoula or wherever you live that would sort of help that? So what's kind of one idea of a practical thing that we could do to kind of push that forward?
I would like to see a green bed tax in Missoula. And that green bed tax money could train a bunch of Conservation Corps youth in Missoula to go out and become Green Rangers. I just call them Green Rangers. But there is a whole bunch of amazing restoration activities that college kids could do in this city and give them a wage that equal or beats what they get at McDonald's, working as a short order cook. Because right now the Conservation Corps in this state is modestly funded, and these kids get peanuts. And when they get peanuts and they really love the work, then it sends a signal to them that it's not worth much. So we ought to be able to at least pay minimum wage to these kids for doing service in our community and in our county. It's just a place to start.
I like that, Green Rangers. Peter?
Well, the salesman in me says, buy a North Slope floor would be one thing. But I tend to agree with Steve that there's a phrase kicking around now called green collar jobs, and that I just heard a speaker in San Francisco speaking on it, that bring the kids into the conservation ideal with jobs. But to that, I'd also add that I think the whole green building thing that that's what I see so much of, that people are really starting to get more and more conscious about how they're living in their houses, how their houses work. The building industry, I think Steve probably knows a statistic, 30% of the energy used in the United States is, I think, residential housing. Just all those things. I mean, once people are more and more conscious, it's not just like changing the light bulb, but when you're thinking how you're going to live, you can make a big difference in where you're going to live.
So do you have any specific thought on how to push that?
I mean, like you're asking for a
Policy-
concrete
a
idea.
Policy proposal. Yeah.
Okay, like a government, well. But
Not government or a private initiative or
But there's
educational-
in the works in Missoula right now, there's a green building initiative that's being developed in Missoula on the part of the Missoula building industry. And that's happening in a number of communities across the country that are developing their own green building standards. And that, I'm sure you're definitely going to hear a lot more about that. But that's something to pay attention to. That's something that's really bringing this a very conscious, mindfulness, if you want to say that. There's a lot of mindfulness that's going to grow out of those initiatives. So
Great.
it's something to push locally.
Great. Gary?
Well, in honor of John Ridley Forbes, I'm thinking off the top of my head that it would be wonderful to, in my own small community, and you may be well down the road in this area in Missoula, but to have a collection of mentors, if you will, people who are doing the kinds of things that these gentlemen are doing to access the kids in the schools. I think of being a part owner of Cafe Regis. We've got the organic gardens in the back. Why not resurrect that notion of letting kids be involved with gardens, if for no other reason to engender a sense of mindfulness about where our food comes from. That leads to, as you've already paid attention to in this community, notions of food sheds. And would it be possible to have some kind of resolution in a community that would require a small percentage of food at least going into the school cafeterias to be locally produced? I mean, where possible, wherever possible. I'm reminded of an experience I had writing a book called Shouting at the Sky, which was a wonderful, compassionate wilderness therapy program I was writing about, not a boot camp, but a compassionate wilderness therapy program for severely at-risk teens, 14 to 17 years old. And I followed 12 of them after they got out of this 8-week program to see how it stuck with them. And the one thing they said why this worked where no other therapy, and they had been veterans of every therapy imaginable, nothing else worked, from suicide wards, 28-day lockdown, drug rehab, you name it, nothing worked. They said the reason this worked is because it was the first place I've ever been where what I did mattered. They were living in the wilderness, and they really, because of the stresses and challenges of being outdoors, had to take care of each other and had to pay attention to the things going on around them. So to give these kids, through experiences with any of the people on this panel, an opportunity to do something that matters and to build the kinds of connections and to understand the consequences of the choices they make might be a great way to end up 50 years down the road in a better place than where we are right now.
Great. John?
The setup for the response to your question is what I've immodestly named Schechter's maxim, which is economies change faster than perceptions and perceptions change faster than politics. As I mentioned, our economy in Jackson Hole is no longer a tourism economy. It's not true in any major tourist place in America. People are moving to these places because they want to and they can. But the perception is, the economic data is very clearly there. The perceptions are still that they're tourism places, and the government the politics lags well behind 20, 30 years. And I mention that because in times of rapid change like our communities, many of our communities are going through, we tend to look to government to be the solution. And government is not institutionally constituted in that way that they can really react quickly to things of rapid change unless it's something like a war. I mention that because, not surprisingly, my suggestion or my thought to your question is 1%. It's worked in Jackson Hole. We've proven that we can get members. We've proven that we can give money out. It's not a lot of money. It's just 1%. But by aggregating it the way that we do, all of a sudden it's not just changing the consciousness of the way that people buy things, but it's also we're able to fund these projects that allow, whether it's Green Rangers or any of these other types of things, there's now a pool of money which nobody but the members control. And so you tend to get people in there who are interested in doing things that are proactive, positive steps toward the future. And this is a funding pool, and the government, it isn't run through referendum, it's not run through politics, it's run through what are good ideas that try to accomplish the mission of our organization. and it's a fabulous tool. It's a little bit of work, but the dividends pay off in all sorts of different ways.
Well, that's great. Well, thanks, John. And I will say on that note of, it's not, looking to government for solutions really only goes so far. And I think everybody on this panel, Steve, in your business, and both in your business as a green builder and in your kind of advocacy work, Peter in your business and your writing, and Gary certainly in your writing and the kind of sort of implicit advocacy that goes with that, and John certainly in the work with 1%, I think you're all showing how kind of private initiative in a sense can really make a dent in the things that we're talking about. So I wanted to thank you for that, and thank you for being on the panel. And I wanted to thank all of you for being here for 2 very full days, and we really appreciate your attendance and support, and please do fill out those surveys, and we look forward to seeing you both around town and here again next year. So thank you very much, everybody.